Okay, so last week we talked about comparative psychoanalysis and critical psychoanalysis. And we talked about how the problem is ideological psychoanalysis. And we talked about how the classical people, many became quite ideological, and then the rebels rebelled against that, and then the rebels became ideological, embracing antithesis instead of thesis, and how the goal of critical psychoanalysis is to not get caught by either thesis or antithesis, and to try to arrive at something like a creative synthesis, and to get the people in the silos to start talking to one another across the silos. And so dialectical thinking we talked about, and so that was the introduction and the postscript. Tonight I'm going to try and cover the content of chapters 1 and 2. And so in chapter 1 I've made a list of points that I want to underline, but one of the main points that I'm trying to make is a fundamental difference between the Freudian and the Kleinian visions of the human situation. Freudians and Kleinians can talk to one another and even be friends because they've got a lot in common, especially compared to the self-relational, interpersonal, intersubjective people with whom they have far less in common. But just because we can talk to one another doesn't necessarily mean we're in entire agreement. And I think there is a fundamental difference between Freud's vision of the human situation and the human problem, the core human problem, and the Kleinian vision of the core human problem. So now you'll notice I have under Klein, I have Eros, Thanatos, and of course that's Freud originally. But Freud didn't do much with that. Anna Freud never really got her mind around it. And the Freudians kind of never really got their minds around it very much. Klein picked it up. I think it's fair to say that Anna Freud and subsequent Freudians, they never really caught up with where her father was headed. They kind of fell back to the earlier drive defense model. And certainly in ego psychology, this drive defense model became the central perspective. Melanie Klein saw where Freud was going, and she went with him and went further. Okay, so what's Freud's vision of our problem? There's a problem between the human in us and the quotes beast, the animal in us. Freud essentially blamed the problem on drives, which, in Instincts and Their Vicissitudes, he says the drive is composed of 4 elements: an aim, an object, a pressure, and a source. And he knew he was not talking about animal instincts, because the human trieb, the human drive, Freud was well aware, differed from animal instinct in that the aims and the objects are acquired, learned. You can shift them around. You can turn the aim to see, to look, into the aim to be looked at. You can turn a sadistic wish into a masochistic wish. You can shift the object from mother to your first grade teacher who you have a crush on in the Oedipal dynamic. So he was well aware that the human trieb are very open to social learning and can be shifted around. But nevertheless, he insisted that they bubbled up from the body, from a somatic source. The drives bubbled up from the body, and he did not mean the brain. He meant a bodily zone. He thought that human sexuality bubbled up from the gonads and the genitals. He could never really specify the bodily source of the aggressive drive. But he thought that the drives, both sexual and aggressive, bubbled up from these somatic sources. He was honest enough to admit that he couldn't pin down the somatic source of the aggressive drive, which should have caused him to question the whole idea of the drives as bubbling up from the body, but it didn't. I wish it had. But he stuck with that. And so, ultimately, our antisocial impulses and inclinations come from the animal, the beast, the somatic part of us. And of course, he's a 19th, early 20th century thinker, and those bourgeois thinkers really thought that our base drives have something to do with the animal, the beast, the dark continent, primitive races, the working class, who he thought the proletariat was lazy, brutish, stupid, and oversexed. Primitive races, the primitive part of us, the animalistic part of us, the beast. And he thinks that's where human aggression comes from. And he thinks that civilization gives us defenses. It gives us defenses against a regression into this primitive kind of barbarous element in ourselves. It was the great Erik Erikson who pointed out that Freud's model of the human being is a centaur model. You know, the centaur, that mythical beast with the torso and the head of a man and the body of a horse. And that's a dualistic image, right? Ego and superego. Ego being reason, superego being morality. Ego and superego are on the human side, perpetually in conflict with id, ultimately on the id side, or at least its roots are in the animal part of the human being. There's your centaur model. Torso and head, body of a horse. This conflict can never be overcome. And here's part of the tragic, pessimistic Freudian vision. I remember Charles Brenner at the Waldorf in New York in about 1982 or 4 or something. He just published The Mind in Conflict. And he stood at the podium and talked about this perpetual conflict, because conflict was the central image of his vision. And people stood up and said, but, I mean, is all we can do in psychoanalysis exchange maladaptive defenses for more adaptive defenses? And he said, yes, that's all we can do. The psychoanalytic cure is taking defenses that are breaking down or that cost too much in suffering, etc., and replace them with more adaptive defenses that permit more pleasure, more success. But the fundamental conflict you can't ever get rid of, because we have this id, this beastly id, and we can't get rid of it. And you know, as far as he's concerned, a boy can never overcome his Oedipal hatred of his father. He thought it was naive, the idea that you could let go of some of the primitive passions, transcend them. No, 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 no. These are permanent for Charles Brenner. All you can do is learn how to manage your Oedipal hatred of your father better than you've been managing it, so that you're not getting fired all the time or winding up in jail or whatever. But the idea of actually forgiving your father, or getting over your hatred of your father, no. There's no room in psychoanalysis for that. These are permanent conflicts. So I think that's the Freudian vision. Now the Kleinian vision is very different. Very different. It's not a mind-body conflict. This is Freud's idea, 1920. He revises his instinct theory, Eros and Thanatos. Eros is more than sexuality. It includes sexuality, but it's a tendency to connect. E.M. Forster's novel, Only Connect. Famous line from that novel. But it's about connection, and it's about ever wider connections, or it's about integration, integrating. Thanatos is a drive to disconnect and disintegrate. Attachment, connection, separation, individuation, connecting, disconnecting. Of course, we all want to do both of these things. This is a core conflict in our nature. Now, those of us who've reached the depressive position and are more or less neurotic, we manage this, you know, one way or another. The need for privacy, and disconnection. Together we work out a compromise of some kind so that we can connect and have a relationship and relate, but we also want to withdraw. People work out their compromises between this. If you're borderline or psychotic, well, let's use Freud's language. Healthier people manage to fuse eros and thanatos, fusion. So they're able to work out blends. We talked about dialectical thinking. Neither thesis nor antithesis, but a synthesis that represents some kind of a blend. I have an unusual blend. My wife lives in Philadelphia and I live here. Tomorrow I'm on a plane. We've done this for 25 years. That's my blend of connection, disconnection. Works for us. Other people manage to actually live in the same house. Some people actually manage to inhabit one bed. Anyway, so varying degrees of fusion. Borderlines have diffusion. So they're at the extremes. They're like idealizing and making idols and worshiping and the all-good object that they want to fuse with. But then on the other side there's the all-bad object which they dread fusion with. Fusion now becomes engulfment, being swallowed, eaten alive. And so borderline relationships, captured beautifully by the playwright Sam Shepard, A Fool for Love. In the stage directions, it takes place in a motel unit. In the stage directions, there's a bass drum hooked to the screen door. And throughout the play, it's boom when the door slams when they come together in the room. And then they split apart. Boom, 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 boom. Together, apart. They can't live with each other. They can't live without each other. The borderline cannot be separate without feeling abandoned, and can't be together without feeling engulfed. And the rest of us who've reached the depressive position can work out some kind of togetherness where I'm not engulfed, I'm not abandoned. Work out a fusion. In severe psychotic diffusion, the object is either God or the devil. And you're either worshiping and longing to merge with divinity, or you're fleeing demonic persecution. The diffusion is even more extreme than in so-called borderline states. So the problem for Klein, the human problem for Klein, is not mind versus body. It's not defense so much versus drives, although fusions of Freud and Klein can and have been worked out. I mean, I work them out. I consider myself a Kleinian Freudian. I still use a lot of drive defense concepts, but I don't think the drives bubble up from anything biological or bestial. But this is a mind-body problem. This is a problem in the mind and heart. You see, this is psychobiology. That's Freud. Psychobiology. This is not psychobiology. This is a purely human psychology. This is pure psychology. The problem is in the mind and the heart of human beings because we're torn in different directions. It's a conflict between love and hate. That's what it is. That's what Melanie Klein is all about. How our loving is all messed up by our hating, and our hating is all messed up by our loving. And we're caught in this problem. In my own work, what I've done really is, in my critique of Freud's theory of the superego, I've lined up conscience with eros and love, and I've lined up the superego with thanatos and hate. Okay, now I'm being very Freudian when I say this, because as Freud's writing went on over time, his description of the superego came to be more and more hateful. The superego he described was essentially aggression turned against the self. It was the aggressive drive turned away from the object back against the ego. And so instead of beating up the person who's frustrated you or betrayed you or whatever, instead you turn that aggression on yourself and you beat the hell out of yourself. The superego fundamentally wants to beat you up. It's like a false priest. Like sometimes it will actually tempt you to sin, like a false priest. Go ahead, sin. And he tempts you to sin because then, once you sin, he can do what he wants to do with you, which is to beat the hell out of you. I mean, fundamentally, he's a sadistic agent. I always think of a particular scene in Ingmar Bergman's film Fanny and Alexander, and the two kids have this stepfather who's like a Lutheran pastor, and he's a sadist, and he loves to beat them. Bergman didn't do this, but I always have the fantasy that if the camera zoomed on this sadistic minister when he's beating the kids, you might see that he's got an erection. Because he's clearly sadistically getting off on beating. That's the superego. And Freud is increasingly describing it that way. And so, you know, in one of his essays, Freud says the cure, the psychoanalytic cure, is the demolition. That's his word. The demolition of the superego. Now the Freudians and the ego psychologists just shrink back from that. They can't take that language. But Ferenczi agreed with Freud, and so did Franz Alexander. They both agreed. Ferenczi says that no psychoanalytic cure is complete until there is a complete elimination of the superego. But immediately James Strachey, and a host of others said, "Oh, that can't be. We can't kill the superego. That's a profoundly conservative. It's like too much. We've got to kill Father, God, superego. No. We can't have that. We need to modify it." Strachey says, "We need to modify it to make it less aggressive, to de-aggressivize it, to modulate it." To take the immature, primitive, sadistic superego and turn it into a mature, more reasonable superego. That was Strachey's rejection of Freud, Ferenczi, and Alexander. Not demolition, modification. Well, let's look at that. Freud, Ferenczi, and Alexander were radicals. They were radicals. They were calling for a complete revolution. Because the superego is the tyrant who dominates the psyche. And they're saying, we got to kill the tyrant. Strachey is like a good liberal. Oh, don't talk to me about revolution. Piecemeal social reform. Okay. That we can manage. And of course the field went with that. The field bought Strachey against Freud, Ferenczi, and Alexander. Now, people thought when Freud said demolition of the superego, that means what are we going to do? Manufacture psychopaths? If we're going to demolish the moral center, the superego, are we going to become psychopaths? Freud says no, we're going to transfer the moral self-control function to the ego. We're going to demolish the superego and we're going to have the ego. Ferenczi and Alexander followed Freud in this. We're going to have reason. Remember, Freud was a Platonist. Plato divided the soul into three parts: appetite, reason, and spirit. And it roughly corresponds: the appetite to the id, reason to the ego, spirit to the superego. So Freud was simply following the Platonic division of the soul into these three parts. And so what Freud was saying is, we're going to get rid of the superego and we're going to have the ego, which is the center of reason, rationality, science, is going to take over the moral control function. I agree with him and Ferenczi and Alexander about demolition, but I don't agree that the moral function can be transferred to the ego. Why? Because since David Hume wrote in the 18th century, reason cannot make value judgments. Science is incompetent. Science and reason are incompetent to make value judgments. If you decide you want to build a bridge, reason and science can tell you how to build it. but they can't tell you whether you ought to build it. You cannot, in Hume's words, you cannot deduce an ought from an is. Science is descriptive, but ethics and morality are prescriptive. Do unto others as you would have them do. Don't do unto others what you don't want them doing. That's a value statement. Science can't do anything with that. So the ego, because it's the center of reason, it can't take over the moral function. In Western thought, the people who understand this best are the existentialists. Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, he understands that you can't go running to reason and science to tell you what to do. In fact, for Sartre, you can't run anywhere because he doesn't believe in God. So you can't go to God to be the big referee who tells you what to do. You can't go to science because it's incompetent to tell you what to do. Who are you going to go to? Well, Sartre gives us the example of a young man during the Second War. His older brother, he's got this old mother who needs him. His older brother has died fighting the Nazis. His father is a collaborator working with the Nazis. The younger brother wants to go to war, but he might be killed, and then who's going to look after his mother? So he's got this dilemma. Should I stay home and look after my mother, or should I go fight the Nazis? And I guess he comes to Sartre. And Sartre points out that you can't go anywhere, really, for advice, because who you go to, you're already choosing the advice you're going to get by who you go to for it. So he could have gone to a priest, but there are collaborationist priests, there are priests of the resistance, and there are fence-sitting priests. So you're going to get the advice that you choose to get by going to the person you go to. So where do you go to get advice? Nowhere. You decide. And you define who you are through your decision. I mean, that's existentialism. Now, I'm not here to advocate existentialism, although I consider myself a Sartrean in that sense. But I'm just trying to make the point that Sartre certainly knew that you can't go to science to get advice on how to live. That's a philosophical, ethical, there's a leap. You define yourself by choosing. So the ego can't take over from the superego. So that's a problem. So I posit conscience. And my work is a plea to reverse the decision Freud made in 1923. Up until 1923, he sometimes spoke of a conscience. He didn't contrast it, but once he posited the superego, he stopped talking about conscience. He merged the superego, or the conscience, into the superego. Conscience, i.e. the superego, he now says. So conscience disappears into the superego. And at the same time, the ego ideal disappears into the superego. He abandons both concepts, conscience and ego ideal. And he allows them to be subsumed by this other concept of the superego. I think it's a shame. I think it was a big mistake. The ego ideal was a very useful concept. Freud talked about, I mean, probably if he'd hung on to ego ideal, we wouldn't have had to evolve Kohut's self-psychology. Because Freud's idea was that you compare your real ego with your ideal ego. And if you see yourself, if you get an A on a paper and you're a student, you get an A, your real ego comes up a little closer to your ideal ego. And you feel a bit of an inflation. You feel pretty good about yourself. If you get a D, the distance between your real ego and your ego ideal is greater and you feel deflated. So self-esteem has a lot to do with these comparisons of your real self to your ideal self. That's useful. That's a useful concept. But he threw it in to the superego. He didn't have a whole lot to say about conscience, but certainly he stopped talking about conscience as anything that could be separate from or challenge the superego. So I'm positing the conscience, and I want to bring back ego ideal as well. So Freud gives us a tripartite model. id, ego, superego. I'm saying we need 5. Ego ideal and superego. 5 structures.
Conscience.
Sorry?
Conscience.
Conscience, ego ideal, id, ego, superego. 5 structures. And once you've got the 5 structures, you can begin to talk about, we're supposed to be, Ernst Kriest defines psychoanalysis as the psychology of man in conflict. And yet we lost our ability to think and address a whole bunch of conflicts by shrinking the theory to 3 structures. When we get back to 5 structures, we can see that there are 15 conflicts. 15, and we've addressed maybe half of them. We've addressed conflicts between the id and the ego, between the id and the superego, between the ego and the superego. But now we can talk about conflicts between the conscience and the superego, conflicts between the conscience and the ego ideal, conflicts between the ego ideal and the id, conflicts between the ego ideal and the ego, conflicts between the ego ideal and the conscience. If you lay them out and you remove the overlaps, there are 15. 15 because there are not only the conflicts among the 5 structures, there are conflicts within each of the 5 structures. And that's 5 conflicts. And then there's 10 among. So within the id, there's a conflict between my love and my hate. Within the ego, there's a conflict, for example, say between my masculine identifications and my feminine identifications. Within the superego, there's a conflict between my values from the old country, say my parents have emigrated, the values of the old country and the values of the new country. The problem that so many first-generation kids have. Conflict, that's just one example of conflicts within the superego. Or there's the conflict in the superego between the laws of the land and the laws of the deviant subculture of crime that you were raised in. I remember I taught for 46 years at Glendon College, and little girls would arrive from Pentecostal homes in northern Ontario, and they'd be in the big city, and their boyfriends would be trying to get them to have sex, which they had been taught was, before marriage, was sinful, but the boys would be persuasive, and the girls would give in, but they sure weren't having any fun. There was a conflict in their superego between the values of their Pentecostal home back up in Sudbury and the urbane values of the city and the university. So conflicts within. There's also conflicts within the ego ideal. Okay, take for example, part of my ego ideal is that I should be kind. But part of my ego ideal tells me that I should also be truthful. But what happens when being truthful is not being kind? Edward Snowden had a conflict, well, not within his ego ideal. I would say he had a conflict between his superego and his conscience. He was a loyal American. He'd been raised to respect the U.S. government. He'd taken an oath to not reveal state secrets. And yet his conscience, he found that what the NSA was doing was just unconscionable. So he became a whistleblower. He decided to go with his conscience, and he defied his superego. My old mentor, Eli Sagan, who I was pleased to have here a few years ago before he died, he, in his book, drew on Mark Twain's story of Huckleberry Finn, who's raised in a southern racist society, and so Huck is racist, of course. He's beaten by his father, and he runs away, and he's on the raft floating down the Mississippi, and he's joined on the raft by a runaway slave, Jim, who becomes his friend, and Jim protects him and looks after him and so on. But all the time, the racism in Huck is saying, you got to turn I won't use the N-word, you got to turn him in. So he writes a letter to Jim's owner, and he's but he can't bring himself to send the letter. I mean, he's having a breakdown on the raft because his superego is pulling him one way, the rules, but his conscience is pulling him in the opposite direction. Finally, he says, okay, I'll go to hell. Turns up the letter. It's going to pay the price of going to hell by defying his superego. I'll go to hell. He tears up the letter. He's not going to turn in his friend. It's a beautiful example of conflict between conscience and superego. So I think that in psychoanalysis we've been really, really hampered in all kinds of ways that I haven't fully thought through, but by the absence of the conscience concept. Take, for example, we training analysts interview applicants for training. Since my work on conscience, I think the most important thing I'm looking for in an applicant is evidence that they have a conscience. I gave a talk about this at the New York Psychoanalytic, and some people said, scoffed, how are you going to measure that in an interview, you know? And I came up with some idea about asking the applicant to tell me something about which they feel guilty about and they have regret. Some crime or sin that they've committed that has harmed someone and that they feel badly about. And at a talk here, Howard Gorman helpfully suggested, in other words, you're not so much looking for a confession as you're looking for an affect. You're looking for the affect of sorrow. That the person is sorrowful, that they did something bad and they hurt somebody, and they now that in order to feel that, you have to have transcended your narcissism to quite a significant degree. You're not operating in the paranoid schizoid position when you're there. You've moved into the depressive position, and you're feeling sad. You're not depressed. That's a common error. There is no depression in the depressive position. There's depressive anxiety, which is what Winnicott renamed the capacity for concern, which is very much concern for the other. Depression is a paranoid schizoid thing where you're beating yourself up and calling yourself no good and useless and bad. But what there is sadness in the depressive position, and there is regret in the depressive position, and there's the willingness to acknowledge that you are far from a perfect specimen, and you're living in a world where there is no perfection, and you know, you don't walk around feeling entirely good about yourself because you're bearing guilt. You're bearing it. You're not beating the hell out of yourself, but you're bearing the fact that you've done some bad things and hurt some people. You're not projecting the guilt onto other people and scapegoating them. You know, you're just walking around with the realization that you're a very mixed bag. That's sanity. But anyway, I think, you see, if I'm interviewing someone for the Institute, yeah, I'm impressed if they have a lot of ego strength, if they have a good intellect, if they're brilliant. Maybe they're going to go on and write brilliant books. So what? That has nothing to do with being a good psychoanalyst, writing brilliant books. I admire it, but I mean, what you want in a psychoanalyst is a person with a conscience, with a heart, not just a good mind. A good mind is a great thing to have. I'm not knocking it, but I mean, what we want in therapists and analysts is a good heart and a good mind and a conscience. Well, I'm not impressed that they know the rules. The guy who founded this society knew the rules. He just felt free to violate them because he felt beyond the rules. Psychopaths, that's their attitude. The rules, they know the rules. The rules are for the others. But they're not for me because I'm special. Right? So if someone tells me all the rules, they know the rules, big deal. Do they have a conscience? So I think the whole field of psychoanalysis has been hampered in its ability to be conscientious to a considerable degree because we lost the concept. We would have been better off. We would have been a more ethical discipline had we not lost the concept. So that's why I'm arguing that we should bring it back along with ego ideal.
Don, on that last point when you were talking about the guilt and the conscience, I
Right.
thought of working with affairs.
Yes.
And it's when the affair partner can actually turn to the person that's been hurt and convince them with loving honesty that they really feel compassion and shame for what they have done.
Right.
That one can move forward. The person who's been hurt can move forward.
Right.
Because I think, as you're saying, the conscience has been revealed.
Activated.
Activated, and the person actually feels a sense of remorse.
Right.
For
Right.
what they did.
Which sometimes can only happen once there's been a thorough exploration and venting of their deep anger at the spouse they betrayed. I mean, how am I going to feel genuine conscientious regret that I had this affair until I've really had a chance to talk about the fact that in some ways she drove me to it? Can
Well,
she
yeah.
hear that?
Pardon?
Can she hear that?
Well, I don't think in the beginning he or she could hear that.
No.
Depending on who had the
It's a
affair.
lot of work.
Well, because you can't start out with, I did this because of you. I mean, they've got to take responsibility themselves for what was inside them.
Well, but
Clearly when you get down the line, you can talk about, okay,
Right.
what was going on in the marriage?
yeah.
That
Although I
put you in a vulnerable position
Yeah.
to look
Yeah.
outside of the marriage. Then you can do it, but not in the beginning, or you will really.
Oh,
lose
of course.
power.
I'm not talking about the technique
Yeah.
of the sequence in which these things are talked about, but
Yeah.
but all I'm saying is I don't think a person can fully take ownership and feel regret for hurting someone while there has been no discussion of what that person did that made you want to hurt them.
Yeah. Well, they do have to get to that.
Oh.
Or what that person didn't do.
Or what they didn't do
Or what-
that
yes,
made you
yes.
want to hurt them. Exactly. I mean, the whole thing has to come out. But I think in any therapy, coming to grips with the conscience, which is not the superego. Let's characterize the difference between these two things. See, like the superego wants to inflict pain. It wants to make you suffer. It's persecutory.
Yeah.
You see, the conscience, people always think, well, the conscience is some easy peasy, all forgiving, anything goes. No. We have this phrase, the bite of conscience. Conscience bites. But it bites regretfully, like it doesn't want to hurt you, but it disapproves of you. It looks at you and it says, you've chosen the wrong path. You're off the path, boy. I'm calling you back to get on the right path again. And if you come back, I will kill the fatted calf. And we will have a feast, prodigal son. You will be forgiven. You'll be welcomed back. Someone trying to get in
Yeah,
there.
the door's closing.
Okay. So the conscience is it wants to be forgiving, but it's not going to forgive until you've turned. It's calling to you to make a turning, and it's not happy with you, and it will keep you awake, No rest for the wicked. It's eating at you. But not in the sense that it desires to, like when it's hurting you, it's like a father who is disapproving of you and reproaching you, but he has tears in his eyes. He has tears in his eyes because he's hurting because you've turned away from the right. And he's calling you back and he's hoping you will turn and come back. That's very different than the superego.
Yeah.
Superego only pretends to be concerned with right and wrong.
again, with the affair situation,
Yeah.
with the injured partner, the superego gets intensely activated.
Absolutely.
And then the person, talks about the situation out of,
Sadism.
yeah.
They become sadistically reproaching, and the poor sinner has to sit there and take it.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's a scene of persecution.
You're talking about
stance.
typical couple therapy stuff?
Well, yeah, Sally brought up the issue of couple therapy
Yeah,
in
I'm
the case of
using it as an
Exactly,
example
okay, great.
of the superego
Yeah.
versus the
Perfect,
conscience.
perfect
Yeah.
example.
Yeah, no, it's a great example. Well, I remember here we had a town hall to try to recover as a society from the fact that the founder had betrayed us all, and he did a lot of very bad things. But there were people at that meeting who disgusted me because they were indulging in a sadistic orgy of reproach. You could see that they were excited about attacking him. They'd had such welled up hostility towards him. Now they felt justified in just dumping their hostility, and it was like a primal killing of the father and a dancing on his grave. You know what I'm saying? And I thought, oh my God, that's as bad as anything he did.
Exactly.
Poisonous,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Oh, it was poisonous.
The moral stance just gets activated.
Moral righteousness
Yeah,
and
yeah.
reproach. That's pure superego,
Yeah.
and that's not conscience. I mean,
And
you know,
it becomes abusive to the...
very abusive,
Yeah.
very abusive. So that's the difference between conscience. It's calling us back, but it has a bite. It has a bite, and you don't sleep well, and you're not going to feel good about yourself until you turn. And frankly, I see this as really kind of the essence of the cure. Let me back up just a bit. I don't think this is so new. I just think that we psychoanalysts have lied about this from the beginning, except in 1914, Freud did not lie. In On Narcissism, he says, unless we must learn to love or we will fall ill. And we must fall ill if, due to frustration, we cannot love. Now, right there, he slipped up and said what he really believed, and he was honest. And he said, psychoanalysis is about turning people from hate to love. It's about turning people from narcissism to love. But he seldom ever talked that way. He immediately replaced it with a medical language. No. We're not about converting people. That's religion, and he hated religion. That's spirituality. We don't want nothing to do with that. But he slipped up in 1914 and said, well, people have to love or they will be ill. But then he substituted the medical language. No, they suffer from pathology. We're trying to help them become healthy. We're not trying to turn them from bad to good. We're trying to turn them from sickness to health. And that's a cover story. I mean, psychoanalysts have always been standing for love over hate, life over death, truth over lies. We are an ethical practice. Now, we don't beat people over the head with this. We're not priests. We try not to moralize. I think moralizing comes from the superego. But I think we do carry the conscience in the treatment. I think the patients want us to have a conscience. They count on us to have a conscience. And we should carry it very quietly. We shouldn't be beating patients over the head with it. But I do believe that we have to carry it until... And what's the cure? They start to be able to carry it themselves. Okay? And why do they come to that decision? Because if they're intelligent people, they learned as I did. Because I tried for many years to be a bad boy. I mean, I tried every way to have my cake and eat it too. I'm very smart. I was pretty good at trying to dodge both superego and conscience. And then finally, I threw in the towel because I just knew it doesn't work. I will always be unhappy. I will always be punishing myself. I'll always be sabotaging myself unless I go straight. So I decided to go a little more about the ego ideal. People who don't like the idea of separating conscience as distinct from superego, they want to stay with the Strachey idea of superego modification, and they don't want to undo Freud's decision and have a separate conscience. I think they're making a mistake. I think that if we had the because I think to think properly we need concepts. You know, there's that old, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, they call it in anthropology. Do we see and then label, or do we label and then see? It's both, of course, it's a circular thing. But certainly having words for things helps us see, and it helps us make distinctions. And so if we have a separate concept of conscience, I think we're more alert to issues that we have been overlooking. And one of the things, well, I mean, I think these have profoundly different sources. I mean, the superego is composed, I think, of two elements. Id aggression fuels it, turned against the self, and then internalization of societal norms. So the superego is normative, and it's socially constructed, and then it's fueled by aggression, turned against the self. The conscience is not socially constructed. And this flies in the face of much social science that wants to see everything as socially constructed. But as we talked about last week, and Hassan brought up, those experiments at Yale that Bloom conducted with little children, 3 to 6 months of age, who already know right from wrong. Now, not that there's no social element in that. At 3 months, you've already had 3 months of opportunity to identify with the nurturer who keeps you alive by feeding you. And so you have plenty of time to identify with the nurturer. But this is not the same thing as taking in socially constructed rules from the society into a normative superego. Long before, Hassan, if you're still there, long before Bloom at Yale, René Spitz, the early child observer, he made films in which a mother has got the baby at the breast, and while the baby is nursing at the breast, the baby's putting its fingers into mother's mouth.
Right.
And then a few months later, she's spooning food in, and then he is spooning food into her mouth. So it's reciprocity. He's receiving love, he wants to give love. I think this is the core of conscience. And I think we all have a conscience. Some people, psychopathic people, are very good at walling it off and silencing it. But, you know, if we're alive, we've been loved. We know what love is. If we've learned language and bowel function, we've been loved fairly well. Someone cared. They kept us alive. We know, and so we owe them. And we feel compelled to give back. I like that phrase you're hearing more and more these days about paying it forward. Good things have been given to us, and so we pay it forward. I once really failed someone, a man who really helped me, my PhD supervisor. And after I got my PhD, I got busy hustling my academic career together, and I wasn't reaching out to him. One day, a number of years later, he called me, and I was down on the Jersey Shore, and I said, let's get together for lunch when I get back. And I got back, I got busy again. We didn't have lunch. Finally, I got around to calling him. I got his widow. So I failed him. Now, a few years later, I met my now deceased old mentor, Eli Sagan, man 15 years older than me. And here was an opportunity for me to act differently and show gratitude. And I did that. Like, we did some fun things together. We presented together here at a scientific meeting. We presented together in Boston. We did a number of things together, and I was very careful to stay in touch with him until he died. So I had to pay it forward to someone else. I couldn't repair with the man that I had failed, but I paid it forward. Anyway, that's conscience in operation. You know, conscience is also about gratitude, and it has its roots in this early relationship, but it also has primate roots. We now know from the animal studies that primates are far more altruistic, far more... Is that the door bell?
No, Hassan just joined.
No, it's not the door, Sally.
It's Hassan, yeah.
Hi.
Hi, Hassan. We were just I was just talking about the child studies again and the animal studies, and I was reminding people that before Bloom at Yale, Renee Spitz showed the baby feeding and wanting to feed mother back, and so the roots of reciprocity are there in the early caretaker relationship. So that's where I see the roots of conscience. People who don't like the idea of separating conscience out from superego say, well, you want to reintroduce the concept of ego ideal. Why don't we just, why can't the ego ideal be a conscience? And by the way, that's what Erik Erikson tried. Erik Erikson was also very unhappy with the psychoanalytic theory of the superego, and he was looking for a conscience, and he thought he could find it in the ego ideal. It didn't work. It can't work. Why? The ego ideal is a completely narcissistic concept. Like when I'm comparing my ego against my ego ideal, how I really see myself as opposed to the way I would like to be, my mind is entirely on me. It's not on the other and the needs of the other. I'd like to polish my image so I could worship it with more enthusiasm by moving it closer to my ideal. Well, isn't that wonderful? That's not having to sacrifice my self-interest at times out of care and concern for the other. Very different. So ego ideal can't be a conscience. That's why I really push this idea of separating conscience out from superego and from ego ideal. And there can be a conflict between conscience and ego ideal. Let me see if I can think of, well, my ego ideal, I could have a lot of pride and egotism invested in being a ladies' man. But that conflicts with my conscience, which is about loyalty to my wife and a desire to not hurt her. Like loyalty could be a superego rule, but the desire to not hurt her, that's conscience. So that can be, there can be a conflict. Yes?
Would you like to hear about the true case?
Sure. Yes.
You mentioned Wall Street, and I agree with you.
Can you speak more directly into your microphone, Hassan? Because we sometimes hear you well, and at other times not.
Can you hear me now?
That's very good, right there.
Okay. You know, you touched upon Wall Street and the lack of whatever you would like to call it, conscience,
Yes.
superego, all of the above. You know, but I had one instance of one patient who I use for teaching. He came to see me because I come from Egypt, and he is an Orthodox Jew. And he came with a skull cap, we didn't sit down, tells me that he moved to Canada from South America because he was doing a lot of money dealing with the luxury second-hand cars. And I think what happened, the mafia got to him. He had to come with a lot of money. So he says to me, listen, doctor, I'm married. I have children. But I love women and I love sex. And I'd like you to help me so I don't feel any guilt about sleeping with
King Henry VIII was bothered by Archbishop Thomas Becket, and he says famously, "Who will rid me of this foul priest?" And so you got a patient who says, "Doctor, please rid me of my guilt and my conscience."
So I apologized to him. I had no training with this.
You said what?
Then
You said to him what?
I apologized because I had no training. None of my teachers taught me anything about this. So I apologized. So he said, you know, it's time to pay you. And, you know, I'm not covered yet by Medicare. So I have a lot of American money. I'll pay you. But you understand, I'll give you cash. You are not going to declare it, you know? So I give you half of...
Since you're not declaring it, I'm only giving you half.
I said to him, you know something? If any doctor you go to accept this deal, this doctor has a fool of a patient.
Yes. Yes.
You pay me every cent.
Yes.
Which he did. But
yes.
I tell you, it was just, I was totally shocked the whole time.
Right.
Now, I mean, we don't get, thank God, we don't get things like this.
Did he go away or did he continue?
Oh no.
He went.
Once.
Okay.
Oh no. He went shopping.
Right.
For people.
But, you know, I mean, one could wish that a patient like that would stay on and would learn that the reason why you see, people say, you know, I agree with the standard psychoanalytic rule. We can't be super ego-ish with our patients. I agree. But what do you do with someone who, say, is telling you about corrupt things that they're doing? Well, I wait until I get more of the whole story. And what I find frequently is they can't hold on to the dirty money. Like I had a guy who was always telling me about how he was getting things that fell off the back of the truck, as it were, but you know, any ill-gotten money he had, somehow it would either be stolen from him, or he would lose it gambling, or someone would steal it. He couldn't hold on to it. Or he would have accidents, he would hurt himself. And so all the analyst has to do is sit back and collect this information, and then, instead of saying, don't be a bad boy, what you say is, look what happens whenever you do that. Whenever you do that, this is what follows. It looks like that kind of thing is always going to follow, unless you stop doing that. Well, you're not telling him how he ought to live. You're just telling him about the consequences of his living. And the consequences could be sleeplessness, it could be nightmares, it could be accident proneness.
Well, this patient would have ended up with HIV.
There you go.
I mean, it's serious. Yes, absolutely.
Yep.
But he had no interest in following in any way or shape or form.
Yeah. Well, some are just incorrigible and you can't reach them. Well, Freud says that funny thing. Freud says someone consults him about such a con man type. And Freud says, with such patients, what we recommend is that they go to somewhere far away like Australia and there find their fortune.
I'm thinking Tony's.
I just thought, you know, to lighten the discussion up a bit. But one of our colleagues, I don't know, is he named Mona? What is her name? The woman? Mona?
A colleague?
Mona, he's talking about Mona.
Oh, you're talking about Nona here?
She was raising her hand. She was raising her hand
Oh.
to say something.
Nona, were you trying to speak?
No.
No.
Thank
Okay.
you.
No. It's okay. But Michael was thinking. Go ahead, Michael.
It reminded me of Tony Soprano, going to the therapist and whacking people at the same time.
Right.
Yeah.
I didn't watch it enough to know how that worked out. I mean, was she ever able to get him to see? Well, yes, because he was having these nightmares of birds, swans, or something in his swimming pool. He was having nightmares of some kind, wasn't he?
Yes.
And this was she able to make the connection between his bad behavior and his nightmares? I mean, was she able to get him to see that clearly?
You know, I didn't see far enough into the series.
Yeah, I don't know.
I
I don't know.
think so.
Well, but
Maybe
that's
we need to see it again.
yeah.
He seemed to have a conscience at times.
Flickering like a light that's about to go out.
So you felt that there was something to work with there.
Yeah,
I mean, that was how they portrayed him.
yeah.
And I mean, I found myself feeling empathy for him as a human being. So,
Right. I think I mentioned last week a psychopathic man that I had worked with many years ago who he usually had his conscience and his superego well locked up and muffled and gagged and bound, and but it got loose. His superego got loose, and there was a serious suicide attempt. So he had a murderous superego. That's why he locked it up and gagged it and kept it down in the basement by the furnace, because it was murderous. But once you put it out of operation, then you can get into all kinds of trouble, which he did. Just to underline the point about essentially psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis, blaming human destructiveness on the id and on the animal in man. And of course, this is completely in keeping with our culture. In the paper, I made a long list of, it's our language. We refer to the beast of British Columbia, Ilsa, she-wolf of the Nazis. He's a cockroach, she's a vixen, he's a snake in the grass, he's da-da-da-da-da. I gave a whole list of our language. This is massive projection of our uniquely human evil inclinations and tendencies onto animals, onto the beast. And like, beasts can't even approach the level of human destructiveness. I mean, we are a uniquely destructive species. We're sort of like a virus that has spread over the planet, and we're wrecking it. Well, we're not wrecking the planet. We're just wrecking the ecosystems that we depend on. And how many species have we driven to extinction? We're uniquely destructive.
The answer, Don, is every species. The book Sapiens. If you read Sapiens.
Sapiens, right.
It lists how human beings, whenever they came in touch near anything, they annihilated.
Yeah.
And we are the only species that kill each other.
Yes.
Lions kill each other.
Yes.
We do each other.
But and now, of course, the punishment is built in because we're going extinct.
Well, absolutely. We are good at it. We have done it so many times.
The sixth extinction is coming.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. But you know, but just think of all of the years in which we tried to deny this. We tried to blame our destructiveness on something else instead of recognizing that it's like one of the defining features. I mean, Julian Huxley wrote a wonderful essay many decades ago called "The Uniqueness of Man," and I used to teach this at the university because I came out of a tradition in social psychology which sees human beings as radically unique and unlike any other animal species. But then gradually I found it harder and harder to teach this because the students were outraged, because when I would be saying man is unique, they would think I was saying superior. And of course I wasn't saying superior, I was saying inferior in many ways. Our uniqueness is our destructiveness, you know. But I don't think that psychoanalysis got this. It certainly Freud did not seem to grasp this. He seemed to think that our destructiveness came from the animal in us. And that's a big, big mistake. I mean, I don't share the pessimism of the British, I quote him in the book, Thomas Hardy. Talk about a tragic vision of the human condition in novel after novel, Tess of the D'Urbervilles and so on, Jude the Obscure. But anyway, he wrote a poem, Hardy. It's called Before Life and After. I can't quote the poem, but it starts off saying, you know, before the birth of consciousness, human consciousness, all went well. A rose was a rose was a rose. Things arose, they died, they reproduced, they died, life. And of course, he's describing animal life, which is in the now. Now, try to get a human being into the now. You spend years in doing zazen, or meditation, to try to get into the now. Well, human beings can't ever really get into the now. You know, we're living in the past, we're living in the future. Animals are just... That's partly why we're so fascinated by animals. They're in the now. But anyway, this poem of Hardy goes on, but then he says, but then the birth of consciousness occurred, and things started to go wrong. And he describes how human consciousness disrupts. And the last two lines of the poem are so deeply pessimistic. He says, ere nescience shall be reaffirmed. Nescience, not knowing. Ere nescience shall be reaffirmed. How long? How long? Or the last line of the poem. I mean, so he's saying humanity is a mistake. We're this bizarre species that emerged, and we should disappear. Now I'm not quite that pessimistic, because along with all of the destructiveness came Shakespeare, and all of those wonderful, all of that music, and all of the art, and all of the wonderful things that humanity has created. So I'm not prepared to be a nihilist and to say it was all a huge mistake, but I get Hardy's point.
Well, who wrote the Brothers Karamazov?
Who
the
wrote?
Brothers, I think.
Dostoevsky. What was it called? Brothers Karamazov.
Tolstoy.
Oh, Brothers Karamazov.
Okay.
Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yes. Which he was much more psychological than Tolstoy, actually.
Yeah.
Dostoevsky was much more analytical and psychological than Tolstoy.
But what's the point of your reference to Brothers Karamazov? How do you see it as addressing this?
Destructiveness.
Oh, the destructiveness.
I don't remember it. I mean, it's another example of destructiveness in a family.
Yeah. Well, yeah, murderousness for sure, right? Yeah.
But aren't we tasked with saying, well, exactly what is the superego? Like, it's not enough to say there is a superego and there is a conscience.
Right.
But I mean, if we're going to quote unquote psychoanalyze or do psychoanalysis, we have to say, well, what exactly is the superego? Well, and what exactly is the conscience, and where, how do they arise?
How do they arise?
And how, in the case of the superego, does it perhaps degenerate from conscience, or does it, or is it the, I don't know.
Well, Freud gives us the answer to the question about the superego. He explains how and then Klein adds to it. I mean, Freud says the superego is heir to the Oedipus complex. So he says you don't get a superego till age 5 or 6. Looking at it from the little boy's point of view, he wants mommy all to himself. He's hating daddy, but if he's reached the depressive position, he's also loving daddy. And so he's in mental torture because he's hating the man he loves. And so he feels guilty for hating the man he loves, for wanting to steal his woman and have mommy all to himself. And he's full of anxiety because daddy is big and scary and dangerous, and if daddy finds out that I want him dead and gone and steal his woman all to myself, God knows what he's going to do to me and to my organ that gets excited when I'm near mommy. And so in the face of castration anxiety, says Freud, and in the face of this horrible feeling of hating someone you love. By the way, Freud is very close to the depressive, talking about the depressive position when he talks about that aspect of it. Even in Totem and Taboo, Freud refers to a guilt before the Oedipus complex. Before they kill the father, they're already feeling guilty because they hate him as well as love him, because the father is their protector, not just their oppressor. And so that's a Kleinian kind of guilt of ambivalence before we even get to castration anxiety. But in the Freudian story, finally the little boy says, "Uncle." He gives up. He says, "Okay, I'll let mommy be daddy's, and I'll get a woman one day of my own like mommy. And meanwhile, I'm submitting to the father and the law of the father. And I'm taking my father and his law into myself. I'm internalizing the paternal law. And I'm identifying with my father. And what do I do with the hostility that I used to feel towards him when I wanted to kill him? I now beat myself the way I wanted to beat him. The attacking tendency towards father, I turn on myself. And now I've got a superego beating me." That's where the superego comes from. So it's filled with hatred, it's filled with aggression, turned on the self. And what's Freud's theory of why we obey it? Because we're afraid if we don't, we'll be castrated. So we're driven into being moral out of castration fear. That's Freud's theory. Now, Klein expands this by saying that the superego begins much earlier than Freud thought. We see evidence of the superego in the first year of life, because the superego, the primitive superego, is simply the persecutory object. In a child in the paranoid schizoid position at the beginning, he splits everything. Everything is either all good or all bad. There's an all good breast mother. There's an all bad breast mother. The bad mother is a persecutor, and I feel persecuted, and I internalize the good and the bad. And I feel persecuted by the bad object, the bad breast, the bad object. And that's the primitive superego. So the superego for Klein is a persecutor. And then she agrees with Freud later. That's a later. What Freud is describing is a later incarnation of the persecutory bad attacking object. And so for both Freud and Klein, the superego is an internal attacker. And now Freud doesn't write about the evolution of a conscience, and I'm being quite Kleinian when I'm saying conscience is the good breast. It's the good part object mother, and it's an identification with the internal good object that I feel is nurturing and loving and protecting me, and I wish to love her back and pass the love on to others. So this is a story of hate on the one hand and love on the other. Conscience and superego. To me, it makes every sense. It makes total symmetrical sense to have a conscience separate from the superego, just as we separate good breast from bad breast.
Yeah, I don't. Lacan puts love on the borderline between the symbolic and the imaginary, and he puts hate on the borderline between the imaginary and the real. Mm-hmm. And I mean, basically, what he did with the superego, the ego, and the id is he turned it into the real, the symbolic, and the imaginary. He sort of translated them.
Right.
And so that puts, and I have been trying to think that through, because So if you're having this intersection of the symbolic, which of course is where the dead father is the whole in the symbolic, and there's the intersection of that and the imagination, or the imaginary, is this love. And so if you see, in most religions, God the Father has love, and you love Him, blah blah blah, and then hate is this where the imagination hits the real, where
well, religion has a hateful father as well as a loving father.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a side point. But I wanted to just wonder if we could put those in that context, or if you've thought that through.
Well, I haven't thought it through because I'm not Lacanian in that sense. I mean, my knowledge of Lacan is patchy. There are aspects of Lacan that make sense to me that I can translate and that I can understand and use clinically. In very broad terms, I get the difference between real, imaginary, and symbolic, but I can't take it as far as you do and talk about hate being at one point and love being at another. This is a language that I don't understand and can't really use. I mean, my main critique of Lacan, aside from his anal sadistic obscurantism, hostility towards the reader and all of that, I mean...
He was French,
They're not all as bad as that, That's not much of an excuse. No, but he's a very, very patriarchal thinker. He has a lot of useful things to say about paternal function, and he has virtually nothing to say about maternal function. And the point is that we have mothers as well as fathers. He's being very Freudian in this bias. Freud didn't have much to say about the pre-Oedipal mother either. It's a blind spot in Freudian theory that gradually got filled in by Klein and Margaret Mahler and a whole bunch of other people. But Lacan really echoes that Freudian bias. But I do find it useful. I see all kinds of people who have failed paternal function, and he's quite right. When the paternal function fails, the boy often becomes a pervert. He gets fixated on the idea that he can be the phallus for the mother, which means the all and the everything for the mother. He can be the apple of the mother's eye. He can gratify her. But of course, now he's stuck with this, Freudian would say, Oedipal victory, or this fantasy of an Oedipal victory, and now he has to castrate himself because father didn't do it. It didn't get performed. So now he has to perform it on himself over and over again. There's insight here. I mean, I think some of the Lacanian writing on perversion is brilliant, much better than a lot of the stuff we find in the Freudian literature. They get the idea of the pervert as having to self-castrate.
Well, yeah, I mean, his take on perversion really, I was thinking about it when you were talking about guilt, because, the persecutory person, or the persecutory part, is really perverted, because it takes the position of the dead father or the God and comes down and assumes, that it can speak for them.
Yeah.
And so that's really, so, that's a kind of, you would place that kind of guilt in perversion.
Yes.
In a sense. But he also speaks about another sense of guilt, and that is the guilt for being born. He found in his clients, and maybe Colette Soler, that there's this, people have this sense they haven't paid for existing, and that is even pre-Oedipal, and it might be connected with, you were talking about, Kleinian's position on certain senses of guilt that are pre-Oedipal.
Yeah.
But he said that that is what he uncovered in his clients, was this guilt, just for the fact that they didn't know how to pay back the fact that they were alive. They thought they'd taken somebody else's place. And they didn't deserve to be alive, and it's a fundamental problem that that he kept encountering, and it gave rise to this sense of guilt, which I don't know if that's connected with conscience, and I'm not speaking necessarily about Lacan. I'm speaking about these concepts, or these feelings we've encountered.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting clinical question. I'm not convinced, though, by the cover story. I'm not convinced that these are people who are guilty simply for being alive. I think there's much more to the story. On a level of fantasy, they might be saying that to themselves. I don't think that's what it's about. what's the real story? What's the real origin of this guilt? I mean, because there's no reason to be guilty just for being alive, unless the story is more complex, unless your being alive is at somebody else's expense. Again, unless you're living because someone else died.
Yeah, I mean,
there's more to the story.
I mean, I think he's presenting it as a clinic, or Colette Soler is presenting it as a clinical fact and not a fantasy, whether that there is underneath the fantasy, that's what she uncovers. There's this sense.
Well, but I think she's only uncovering the tip of the fantasy.
Right.
I think there's a lot more in that fantasy. Look, I mean, siblings. Freud knew about sibling rivalry. He wrote about it, but they subsequently, psychoanalysis kind of dropped it. Now it's made a big comeback. Juliet Mitchell did a whole book on sibling. But I've seen in my practice, some of my patients are far more troubled by sibling issues than they are by issues involving the parents. Now, of course, my wife did a review of Juliet Mitchell's book, and she said, well, this is all very well, but where were the parents? You know, when the sibling relations become really problematic, you have to ask, where were the parents? So the older boy bullied the hell out of the younger boy. Where are the parents, you know? But there are a lot of patients who, well, when a sibling dies, that's a disaster. For the surviving siblings, oh my God, they all think they killed that baby or that child who died, and they may persecute themselves for the rest of their lives as killers. It's all fantasy. Well, not entirely, because part of the reason they feel they were a killer is that a part of them wanted to kill that sibling. And when that sibling died, a part of them wanted to dance on the grave, you know, because they survived and the other one died. And boy, people persecute themselves for those kinds of things. So beneath this idea that there's some guilt in my just being here in this world, that's the beginning of an inquiry, it seems to me.
That seems to me like the person is feeling guilty. I'm thinking about original sin, and that the person has assumed guilt for their parents' original sin.
Oh.
And therefore, why am I alive? My parents sinned, and I'm the one who has to pay for it.
Now that's very interesting. See, Freud wrote a whole paper on borrowed guilt. Brilliant. The idea that you've got a narcissistic parent who will not take delivery on his guilt because of his narcissism, and he basically trains the child. He passes the guilt on to the child. Here, son, you carry this. You be the guilty one. I'm not guilty. You be the guilty one. It's a scapegoating mechanism that narcissistic people do. I mean, we call it guilt induction. Some narcissists...
Kleinians call it guilt induction.
Guilt induction. I mean, some people are brilliant at it. And you don't want to read about guilt induction. You read Friedrich Nietzsche. You read The Genealogy of Morals. Because that's what that book is all about. Here are these poor, impoverished peasant Jews. And here are these Romans on giant horses with armor and swords. And if you get into a fight with one of those Romans, you're going to die. But here's the genius, says Nietzsche, of the Jews. They came up with a religion in which it is guilty and wrong to be strong. You induce guilt for being strong. And now they're so guilty for being strong, because the meek shall inherit the earth. You see, not the strong. The strong are evil. The weak are good. So if you're strong, you're now going to fall on your own sword. So that's guilt induction. And Nietzsche says this was taken over by Christians and by feminists, you know, who will make men feel guilty for being men. You know, me too. And the social justice warriors are alive and well. But anyway, Nietzsche had great insight into this process of guilt. Because if you induce guilt in someone, they can't fight you. They can't fight back because they're crippled by guilt. They have both hands tied behind their back. But I mean, if a person overcomes their guilt through analysis, they can be very strong. But some people are some people have the talent. They have a great talent for guilt induction. They have the talent for stepping into the role of the paternal superego. And they will remain very calm and apparently mature, and they will look at you as if you're just being a naughty child and you know it.
And this is all unconscious on their point.
Maybe, I'm not so sure. If
doing that to you, how do you suggest that you handle it?
Well, the only way is to be very clear with your own conscience. I mean, if you are really, really in tune with your own conscience, you can refuse the projection. You can say no.
Yes, you refuse the projection, but how do you get them to stop doing it?
Oh, well, you fight them directly. You don't let them get away with it. You call them on their bullshit.
Yeah. If you let something go for so long.
Oh, yeah, that's what people do. They let it go, and they let it go, and they let it go. And I see this particularly in marriages where there's a fundamental conflict, and either the man or the woman, whichever, they've let it go. They've caved for years. They have avoided the conflict. And it just eats like termites eat the inside of a house until the house collapses. Avoided conflict will just eat the heart and soul out of the marriage. These are a couple who needed to fight. They needed to have plenty of fights, and they didn't. So, of course, then they stop having intercourse, because where you don't fight, you also don't fuck, if I may use the word. These two things go together. The necessity of fighting. I mean, I don't mean crazy, violent fighting. I just mean really having it out, you know.
I just want to say, Nona posted the poem you talked about by Thomas Hardy.
The Thomas Hardy. Thank you, Nona. It's up there, is it?
What's the title of the poem?
Before Life and After.
Okay.
Can you read it out loud?
It's a long poem, sure. A time there was, as one may guess, and as, indeed, Earth's testimonies tell, before the birth of consciousness, when all went well. None suffered sickness, love, or loss. None knew regret, starved hope, or heart-burnings. None cared whatever crash or cross brought wrack to things. If something ceased, no tongue bewailed. If something winced and waned, no heart was wrung. If brightness dimmed and dark prevailed, no sense was stung. But the disease of feeling germed, and primal rightness took the taint of wrong. Ere nescience shall be reaffirmed, how long, how long?
Yeah. An amazing poem. Beautiful. I've always loved that.
Well, just to be a spoiler here.
Yeah.
Of course, you know, it's a vain hope and a total fantasy to imagine that life can be as smooth as the promise is.
Mm-hmm.
People were always screwing up.
Oh, of course.
And so nescience is, on the other hand, not likely to happen. It'll be recurrent.
Well, it's going to happen. It's called the sixth extinction. It's coming.
Constantly. Well, yeah, at that point, we don't know even.
It's pretty clear what's coming. I mean, I don't like succumbing to total pessimism about the sixth extinction, but man, what are we doing to prevent it? Hardly.
Not very much.
We just had an election.
Not very much.
Terrible one.
Yeah, I mean, we're not doing much. It seems like nescience is coming, but anyway, to take your point, I entirely agree. You know, like I'm a secular Christian, an atheist Christian, and from Christianity, I take definitely, and from Judaism, I take the doctrine of the fall of man. I mean, we're fallen, we're broken, we're a defective, we screw up, and we certainly screw up our ecosystems. We set out to do something, we try to anticipate the consequences, but there are always unanticipated consequences, and things just get worse in so many ways. But there's also great beauty. There's love. There's George Friedrich Handel and the Messiah. There's, it's
I have
such...
a question for you.
Yeah.
How do you define being a secular atheist Christian?
Oh,
You got 3 minutes.
3 minutes. All right.
Well, I asked it then when you...
Look, when I'm Kleinian, so I know I don't live in the depressive position all the time. I oscillate between PS and D. When I'm in PS, like I was in the weeks leading up to my operation for prostate cancer, I was in PS, and my religion came back, and it wasn't secular Christianity. I was praying. And on the level of PS, I wear this cross around my neck, and I never take it off. One day I took it off, and I drove halfway to York, realized my cross was off. I turned around and went home and put it on, and I was a half an hour late for my lecture because I can't function without this thing on. That's paranoid schizoid functioning. It's magical. It's supernatural, but most of the time I don't live there, and I don't defend that. In fact, I'm critical of that. I consider that to be primitive, magical thinking. I try to not be there, except when I'm about to go into surgery, and after. I did a video about this. When I woke up in the hospital, there was this nice woman wearing a hijab. I kept running into her in the waiting room, like before the surgery, and she was there. And then she was in the bed next to me with a curtain, and she had her whole village in there. So I'm waking up from morphine, and the babies and the grandparents, and they're all there, and they're all speaking Arabic, and they're praying. And I was praying with them, and I was so glad they were there, because I was in a paranoid schizoid state. They were worried because I have a bit of atrial fibrillation, and they were afraid that the anesthetic they might never get the heart going again, and so I was worried, and I was scared. I was majorly anxious, but I was denying my anxiety. I wasn't aware.
So are you thinking the Christian, are you saying, this is a very bold question,
Yeah.
Are you saying the Christian part is a paranoid schizoid?
Well, I'm saying magical Christianity, supernatural Christianity is paranoid schizoid. Of course it is. It's magical thinking. It's woo-woo. And I don't respect that kind of Christianity. I don't respect that. But there is depressive position Christianity. You see, Christian culture contains not only great art, but it contains great wisdom. The first shall be last and the last shall be first. I mean, I'm a socialist. My socialist politics are rooted in the New Testament. Jesus was a communist. And he was a brilliant psychoanalyst. He says, why do you complain about the speck in your neighbor's eye when there's a beam in your eye? Now that's Melanie Klein. That's projection. Jesus got there long before Melanie Klein did. There's brilliance. If you demythologize it and strip it of all of the magical stuff, there's tremendous wisdom in the New Testament and in the Old Testament. Those stories. I recall a meeting here in which a colleague was scoffing at religion and so on and so forth, and he went on to talk about severe sibling conflict, and I simply said, Cain and Abel? You want to learn about sibling conflict and the consequences. The Bible has got a story for you. There's a lot of psychoanalytic wisdom in the Bible. So when I call myself a secular Christian, I mean that in a demythologized, non-magical way, I find great wisdom in the New Testament. And I find a conscience there. You see, because in my thinking, you could replace the word conscience with Christ, the voice of Christ. There's an ethic, a Christian ethic in the New Testament. And it corresponds with what I'm calling conscience. I'm not going to speak to my psychoanalytic colleagues about the voice of Christ. I'll get tarred and feathered and thrown out of the Toronto Psychoanalytic Society. So I'll talk about conscience versus superego. But in my mind, it comes to pretty much the same thing. But, you know, there's a whole tradition in theology of secular demythologized. Starting in the 1920s, scholars started to translate the key stories of the New Testament into a secular language, using Heidegger's existentialism. I mean, the Judeo-Christian religion is existentialist, right? Is Islam, Judaism, and Christianity all against Freud? They believe we have free will and responsibility. Hassan was talking about responsibility. The major religions attribute free will and responsibility to us, and they speak to us about guilt and the need to turn away from unrighteousness towards righteousness, not self-righteousness, but doing right instead of wrong. I mean, there's an ethic there. So that's what I mean by secular Christianity. But I'm not merely a secular Christian because I don't live entirely in the depressive position. Show me someone who does. We all indulge in magical thinking from time to time, especially when we're anxious. Yeah.